Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Criminal, Kill or Be Killed, the just-launched Panel Syndicate title Friday, and the upcoming graphic novel Pulp from Image Comics. It's Ed Brubaker. Thanks for coming on, Ed.
Hey. Oh, it sounds very professional.
I know. That's like the only...
That would sound like pre-recorded to me.
I've done it so many times. The funny thing is I do an outro, too, where I walk through my patrons, and I've actually said those people's names so many times that if somebody drops off, I always mess it up like a million times before getting it right, where I'm used to saying their name in order, and then it just breaks. It's ridiculous.
Oh, yeah. Like how you memorize like the McDonald's recipe from the commercial. Good.
So we're here to talk about Friday, your new post-YA Panel Syndicate series with Marcos Martin and Muntz Vicente. I'm going to do the solicit so everybody knows what it is up front. Friday Fitzhugh spent her childhood solving crimes and digging up occult secrets with her best friend Lancelot Jones. Both of those names, by the way, absolutely amazing. He's the smartest boy in the world, but that was the past. Now she's in college, starting a new life of her own, except when Friday comes home for holidays, she's immediately pulled back into Lance's orbit and finds that something very strange and dangerous is happening in their New England town. I love the first issue. We know the origins of it from the back of the first issue, and I'm going to get into that here in a little bit. But I wanted to start with kind of the broader appeal side of things. I know that there are a lot of variables here that likely played a part, but you know, when you got that email from Marcos and you had that minute in your head where you're like, I just need to think about this for a second, and then I have the perfect pitch from Marcos. What was it that made this project come together so quickly in your mind?
I think it was something I'd been sort of, you know, it's like one of those things where I would come back to it every now and then in my head. I would think about like, oh, I could do this or I could do that. Like I have a bunch of different projects that I've like started at one time or another that just didn't feel like I was ready for it yet. Or Sean and I, before we did Kill or Be Killed, were about to do something else, and then I had the idea for Kill or Be Killed, and it just felt like just more exciting to do than the thing I was like sitting there sort of struggling with. So we went and did that instead. And Friday was an idea that I think I started working on initially, like in my mid to late 20s, when I was living around the corner from a library and just sort of rereading and sort of digesting just like a ton of like 60s and 70s like young adult books, which were, you know, just a lot of fun to read, like, because I'd read them when I was like a little kid, and then you read them as an adult and you realize the people writing them were like in their 40s or 50s sometimes. So it's just really interesting to see. And I think it's one of the hardest genres to write, actually, because you have to do a lot with not that much. Mm-hmm. You know, because the books can't get too long, really. But the best ones, you know, really just, you know, like I just wanted to read everything about those characters, even, you know, rereading them in my 20s. Like I just got totally obsessed with like The Great Brain and Encyclopedia Brown and Harriet the Spy. I read like all the other two books, like the one that she was working on when she died, that's about Sport, her friend down the street. But yeah, I don't know. I always had this idea to do, you know, a kind of series that would be about someone who their past is basically like, you know, the books that we didn't read, but there would have been like 10 books about, you know, like Friday and Lancelot, like would have had like a series of a bunch of books. And, you know, so we can kind of all start from the point of everybody's read a bunch of different young adult series, and a lot of them have, you know, 4 or 5 things in common. And that's been one of the most interesting things, actually, about working on releasing the first issue, was like all the mail that we've gotten from people. They're all like, you know, mentioning their own favorites and wondering if those were inspiration stuff. And like 80% of them is like stuff I never read. I was like, oh, so it's really interesting to see how many people like had their own like favorite like YA detective series that they were into. But yeah, I guess I had been waiting for, you know, a moment, I think, to really think about what else I wanted to do. I'd been only writing comics for Sean for a long time. and I was just starting this overall at Legendary, and I got that email from Marcos, and I just thought about it for a minute because I just thought, well, I'm never going to get a chance to work with this guy ever again. I'm sure, he's probably writing to other people. Someone's going to say yes. Like, and then I suddenly just had I was like, oh, well, if he was interested in like adding a sort of Edward Gorey kind of crosshatchy, creepy 60s horror, kids book vibe to what he's doing because his art has changed a lot since like when he was doing Daredevil. He draws like much more like something out of like the 30s or 40s newspaper strips almost. And that's some of my favorite, art in comics history. It's like old newspaper strips and stuff like Gasoline Alley and Little Orphan Annie and stuff like that. So, just seeing his art just kind of made it all fall into place. I just kind of wrote him back and I said, well, here's the gist of the idea. I don't think I had everyone's names at that point. I had the basic idea that it would be about, a girl who was basically like the sidekick / bodyguard to the like teenage Sherlock Holmes of her weird New England town, and that it would be like Lovecraft meets Corey, and and then I broached like the trying to do it with like a lot of cross hatching, and I think we even went back and forth about whether to do it in like black and white and grayscale at one point. But yeah, it just kind of all came together. It was not, I've had stuff like that happen before where you just, you've sort of sat on an idea and thought about it long enough that when you finally sit down to start writing it, it all just kind of comes out. But I just really had this fantasy for a long time in the back of my head of like a sort of plan B career where I could have like, been happier doing something else. Like we all have those moments of like, I should have done this instead. And my wife and I and our dog used to like walk by this one house when we lived in Seattle. We would walk up the hill and go look at the lake, and we would walk by this house, and it was this crazy Victorian house that had like the rounded edges where they would kind of like a castle or something. And I remember always looking in this one window as we walked by because it was like a circular room that had a fireplace in it. And I just thought whoever lives there should write like children's books or young adult books, and they could just sit there next to that fire in that room. And so I just had this fantasy of like, that would be like a really fun life. And so I think there was some part of me as a writer who just wanted to sort of get to that idea of like the grown up, child detective thing.
There's like a little personal wish fulfillment in there to a certain degree.
Yeah, I guess, or just this idea of doing like a series character, like there's something very comforting, and especially right now when everything feels like fucking crazy, like there's something really comforting about like the Rockford Files or like a series of detective novels that all star the same person. Like there's something that feels very orderly and right about the world.
Yeah.
Like Poirot is always going to fucking solve it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in a time when you don't have any answers, like going to the people that always get the right answer there's something comforting about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's something, like a lot of those mysteries are called cozies. And it's like, because it makes you feel like cozy inside while you're reading it. I know it's not because of that. It's because it's more like a tea cozy kind of story where everyone sits around and talks about who did it. But yeah, there was just, I don't know. It was a weird thing. It did feel like both a burst of inspiration and like sort of letting a dam of like 20 years of thinking about this thing kind of sort of come together. And, but I don't think it would have happened had Marcos not written to me. Like, I don't think I would have ever sat down and really come up with this story. And it's funny too, because like once we started working on it and I started seeing, even more of the art come in and stuff, like it just keeps expanding. Like initially, I think I thought it would only, be like a little mini series that we did or something. But now it's like the story, the first 3 chapters, like turn out to be what I thought was going to be 1 chapter's worth of stuff.
Wow.
So yeah, it's like, it's taken me like I don't know, like close to like 70 or 80 pages to get to where I thought the first chapter would end.
That's awesome.
We'll see how that goes.
I did like you wrote about this in the back of the book, I think. Maybe not, but you talked about how because this isn't a single issue series that's in like the direct market or wherever, you can kind of it gives you flexibility that you wouldn't have otherwise. You don't have to do 20 pages or 22 pages in a chapter. You can do you can do a 10-page chapter, you can do a 40-page chapter, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly. That's like my thinking. Marcos would like it to be, you know, somewhere in the same ballpark.
Sure.
So that readers feel like they're getting roughly the same amount of content every time. But I'm also like, yeah, but a chapter should just be as long as a chapter needs to be, because we'll put this out in a book later. And, you know, but I guess if we had like 2 really short chapters, we'd probably like put them out together,
right,
you know, instead of, but yeah, like a couple of times I've thought a chapter was going to go like 16 pages though, and it's gone a lot longer. Chapter 2 is actually like 36 or 38 pages. So
yeah,
it went like it's a good deal longer than chapter 1 did. And I thought it was going to be shorter initially, but there's something about seeing him draw the stuff. It just makes me want to spend more time with the characters too.
Well, and I think it helps a lot that, so you look at King's Hill, you look at like that one page where Friday had just gotten off of the train and she's walking out, and you look and there's this marquee and it has Christopher Lee on the marquee. And then you look at there's that one shot where I think Lancelot is about to get back into the car and she's thinking about saying something to him. And you look in the background and there's just this ambulance that immediately evokes a different era. And it's just like so perfectly done by Marcos. And I think part of it, and I might be speaking out of turn.
Yeah, there's a lot to look at.
Yeah, I mean, the world building that Marcos is doing in there is like, I mean, I've had Marcos on the podcast a couple times, and he's not somebody who takes plays off. And so seeing the way he fills the world is so incredible. I mean, I imagine it's just like you want to keep living it in yourself almost.
Yeah, no, there's like one of his sketches that he sent me of her. He sent me like 5 or 6 pages one morning. And one of them was her like skating, and she was like the 12-year-old version of her, and she was holding a hockey stick. And I immediately had like an idea for a scene. And so I was like, oh, then that's like a major scene in chapter 2. But yeah, it's a really fun book to be working on, especially right now when we're all like locked indoors and they're locked indoors with kids. And, you know, like, it's been fun to have like something to focus on. And, you know, and then releasing the book, we had to do like a bunch of publicity and, you know, trying to spread the word about it. And of course it's like nearly impossible to release something right now, even though we thought it would be like the best time in the world to release something. In some ways it's like one of the harder times to actually get people's attention.
Interesting, because they're so focused on just the world right now.
Yeah, everyone's kind of seesawing back and forth between like panic mode and trying to make themselves feel better. Mm-hmm. Like when people hear about the book, they're like really happy to have a book to read. But like the day we released it was like, if you looked at, I'm not on Twitter, but I went to look at like the Panel Syndicate stuff, and like basically anyone involved in comics on Twitter that day was just all about like the auctioning to try to raise money for comic stores, which, you know, was totally like a great cause. But yeah, it was like the few people in comics like who noticed we were releasing a book that day. It was like it felt like it took like 24 hours or more before like even friends of ours noticed we took the book out.
Yeah.
I was like, I think under normal circumstances that would have been different. I'm still really glad we released it now, and we've gotten like tons of mail from people who bought it. So I feel like it really did like serve its purpose of giving people something else to sort of, you know, look at and think about for a while. And it really, you know, every single person writing in seems like it really did hit that sort of childhood nostalgia, comfort food thing, which is what we were really going for.
Yeah, which is exactly what we need right now.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I feel. I'm like, I don't want to watch The Plot Against America right now.
No kidding.
Like, I want to watch it, but I don't want to watch it right now.
Yeah, exactly. I really do want to watch that show, but I've resisted it. I don't know why. I'm like watching, there's like that Star Wars animated series, The Clone Wars, and there's just something about the music playing and all that stuff. Oh, seeing like these characters I know, it's just like, it's like what you said, it's like comfort food. You need something.
Yeah, no, we're having like group movie nights where like a bunch of friends are all on like a text chain and we all start a movie at the exact same time. And we're just picking like really dumb movies that it's fun to make fun of, really, because, otherwise you're not going to text. Like, we chose a good movie like one of the early weeks and it was like, oh no, this is no good. Everybody's just quiet because they're watching the movie. Then we chose BMX Bandits and it was like the greatest 90 minutes ever.
If you want to really blow their minds, you should put on The Howling 3, The Marsupials, which is a movie about marsupial werewolves. It is unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Well, the first Howling, I think, was written by John Sayles.
I did not know that. I don't think the third one was.
Back in his, like, doing movies for Roger Corman days.
Well, the third one is flat out spectacular. My friends and I used to have just a night where we'd watch kind of bad movies. And that's on my Mount Rushmore of bad movies. It's just, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's like an artistry to doing something, like there's like a transcendence to doing something that you're taking really seriously, but there's something that goes wrong there, and it's just insane. And I love it. I recommend it to people on the regular.
Yeah. No, flawed. I mean, there's stuff where it's like you could tell they didn't care if it was going to be bad, and then there's stuff where they were really trying to make a good movie, and it just came out like crazy. Yeah. Like, it's just it's a whole thing. It's funny because I grew up in that era, like the 70s and the 80s. Like in high school, we would watch like bad movies and make fun of them. And then Mystery Science Theater became like such a huge thing. And personally, I never got into it because I was like, but I'm just watching them make fun of the movie. Like,
that's what my friends and I do.
Fun of the movie.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. I enjoy like the riff track stuff, but then I start making jokes over it. And then I'm like, I feel like I'm doing my own version of riff tracks. This is wrong. I shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, it's funny.
Well, so I want to go back to
a drinking game.
Yeah. I want to go back to a couple of things you said. So you talked about how like these things come up in short bursts, and you also talk about the kind of long game element. And both of those things were things I wanted to bring up. One of it was partially because I just wrote a piece on Wildstorm, and I reread Sleeper for that, and it was very fortuitous because I was talking to you. And one of the things. So in the back of Friday, you shared that Marcos reached out to you to see if you'd be interested in writing something for him. And as you mentioned, you thought about it for a minute and immediately had a basic pitch for the comic. And then at the end of the fourth volume of Sleeper, you talked about how when you were finishing up Point Blank, that Scott Dunbier and Jim Lee reached out to you and said they wanted a spin-off. And you had a similar situation where it was like you really just need a minute or two, and you're like, oh, this is my angle. Do you feel?
Yeah, that one was really like I was like, I don't want to write more superhero stuff. I got no ideas. And then a minute later, I was like, oh, wait, that might be fun.
Yeah. But I mean, do you feel like I don't know if pressure is the right word, but it's kind of like you need these like outside pushes to help with the idea creation.
Well, it's somewhat that, and somewhat, it helps you like decide, like make your choice, because so much of writing is about like what choice you're making. And like I always say, the only real writing lesson is that all writing is just kind of calling bullshit. Like when you're watching a movie and you're like, oh, bullshit, why wouldn't he be on the phone right now? Or like all that. That's what you're doing when you're doing that. When you're writing, you're just doing that to yourself. You're like, yeah, but okay, but why doesn't the sheriff say something? Or why doesn't well, why is she still in the house? Like, you're just doing that to yourself. It's like you have to sell yourself on every moment of your story, because if you can't buy it, then no one else will. So, I just feel like sometimes when you have like those moments, it's like it allows you to sort of make the choice of like, okay, well, here's what that idea needed to be then.
Right.
Like I always say, one of the reasons that I'm so prolific as a writer is because Sean Phillips is a really fast artist. Like, Sean needs a script like, every 2 to 4 weeks. And, like I'm it's like it allows me to get out of my own way sometimes and just be like, all right, here's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that totally makes sense because it's like I think sometimes it reminds me of something a different role completely. But I had Matt Wilson, the colorist, on my podcast, and he talked about how I think he was doing about coloring 6 comics a month at that point or something along those lines.
Yeah,
yeah, and he was talking about how if he had less books, like I was we were kind of discussing how that would change his work, and he's like it wouldn't really change it. It would just mean that I would do 2 books and I would stretch out that work. And it would basically be kind of self-defeating. He's like 6 is kind of like his sweet spot on how many he could do at that time. I don't know where he's at right now.
Yeah. Wow.
But it is like sometimes it's like the outside external pressures can be it's like a direction for you. It reinforces ideas you already had, but now it's just like an inspiration to push you forward.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think there's like a Fellini quote about that where he talked about how if the studio didn't give him like a start date, he'd never finish a script, and if he didn't have like a release date, he'd never finish editing. Like it's always art is like being prized from your hands.
Yeah.
Like I think that's part of why, in my mind, being a novelist seems like the hardest thing that you could possibly do because you just have to do everything yourself.
Right.
And like every time I've tried to write a novel, I just get lost in the weeds somewhere. It's like I need to be able to break it off every 20 or 30 pages or so and send something to an artist and then have the back and forth and that extra time to think about what happens next. Like I just that's been my life, is like creating comics. So but when I read novels, sometimes I'm like, man, this must have been so much work.
Yeah.
Like, this is like 800 pages and they did it all themselves. They probably read it like 4-5 times before they got it to this.
Yeah, I mean, just think about like George R.R. Martin. I mean, it's like he continues getting additional pressure upon additional pressure on him because it's like he's clearly in a place where he doesn't know what the right answer is or can't necessarily finish it, and like the world is literally watching. It's
yeah. I mean, come on, we're never getting the last 2 books in that series. Like, we may get one, but we're definitely not getting whatever his end would have been. I mean, we're in global pandemic, the global pandemic may be the only thing that stops us from dying immediately in, global warming.
Upside.
But there's no 2 George R.R. Martin books left in humanity.
Poor Game of Thrones, Song of Fire and Ice, or Ice and Fire fans out there. But so in terms,
no, I'm just kidding. He'll finish that. Well, honestly, I would think when the TV show ended, when that moment where the TV show passed him, I was like, oh fuck, we're never getting those books now, because now all the pressure's off of him, because it's like, fuck it, I blew it. I didn't finish the thing before they caught up to me. And, now his ending, or all the things that he told them about about what was going to be in the books, like obviously he's going to do it differently, and probably he'll do a lot of different stuff instead. But yeah, I just kind of thought when the show ended and so many people were really mad about it too, that would spur him to be like, all right, well, I'm back to the books now.
Yeah.
But then he just took a year to sort of travel around and do speaking tour.
The funny thing is when I was in college, it was 2002 to 2006. There was a couple of my friends read this series, and they were.
This is by the way, the nerdiest possible tangent we could go off on. You really need to get me to start talking about Hobbit so that Braxton can make fun of me for this later. We're on the George R.R. Martin rant. I just did the George R.R. Martin should work on his fucking books rant.
Well, the last thing I'll say in this is my friends in college were obsessed with the books, and they followed his live journal or something like that, and they were so mad because he posted a picture of him petting baby lions or tigers or something like that, and I just remember very distinctly my friend was like, "Stop petting fucking tigers and go write your book," and that was 15 years ago, and it's really funny, but.
Oh yeah, no, people are mad about it. Obviously it would be great if he wrote those last 2 books. I just don't see them. I just don't see it happening.
Well, let's get back to your stuff. For the long-term thing I wanted to bring up. So I was looking at a review somebody brought up, and somebody mentioned Britt Black or Britannica Black from the criminal arc Last of the Innocent, who is also a grown-up child detective. And then that made me think of, In Sleeper, you have Miss Misery, who is a character who basically, if she doesn't do horrible things, she starts effectively dying. And I mean, that's kind of similar to Dylan and Kill or Be Killed, in the sense that he has this like demon who's basically like, murder people or you're going to die. And
I guess.
Well, I mean, in a vague way, but that's one thing I was curious about, is like, it seems like sometimes there's things that kind of pop up in your head, like threads that show up in your mind. And do you find that sometimes there's things that you kind of introduce in previous works, or you kind of think about,
Oh yeah.
They just develop and grow from
totally.
there?
Yeah, everything kind of grows out of the thing that came before it on some level. Like, just even, I'm trying to think of the most recent examples where I can look at it. Well, you can look at the My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies, like, sort of made me want to go back and do more criminal and finally tell that criminal story about, the real death of Teague Lawless and how it all happened, and write about Leo and Ricky as teenagers. And, I feel like you can always see just moments of it. Like Kill or Be Killed actually initially started growing in my head when I was doing one of those criminal magazines, the one where Tracy and Teague are on the road, and Tracy's like a teenager and he's reading like a sort of weird kung fu werewolf comic.
Yeah, I got that right behind me.
Yeah. So that comic, that's like the germ of Kill or Be Killed in there. It was like the story within the story about the kung fu werewolf. That was like me riffing on Spider-Man and Werewolf by Night and like Master of Kung Fu all at one time. But the dynamic of like the two roommates and the girl that they both love, like that was loosely based on something that like an old roommate of mine told me about him and his best friend and his best friend's girlfriend, like when they were in like college. But also obviously loosely inspired by Peter Parker and Harry Osborn and Mary Jane. And then I had so much fun writing that part of it that I think I just started noodling around on the idea of like, what would be like my version of, a masked hero story. So I could try and sort of write like, our version of like what a superhero comic might be if there weren't any superhero comics and we were just doing this thing. And then it grew into what Kill or Be Killed became, which is much more sort of a meta, I don't know, Death Wish meets Catcher in the Rye or something.
Yeah, I think it's when I was preparing for this, I was reading a lot of old interviews you had done, and there was a lot of times people would ask you questions about like themes and things like that, and it didn't seem like something that really comes up to you. Like, would you say you're more of, you know what I'm saying? Like, not like you're not like I'm thinking about the position of a father in a person's life or something like that as you're jumping into stuff. But do you feel like you're kind of an instinctive writer in some ways? Like it's you feel like the right directions as you're starting to go down them?
I mean, yeah, there's like all sorts of things that people use to describe writers. Some people say you're either an architect or a gardener. An architect like plans everything out, and a gardener just sort of knows what the plant's supposed to look like and knows how to start growing it.
I like that one.
They don't know exactly how it's going to get there. I definitely feel like I'm much more, I usually start with like a character or like a loose idea for a character. And, a lot of it is just, what do I feel like I need to write about? Especially the longer that I've been around and been publishing, the more I kind of am like, all right, well, what haven't I written yet that I still want to write? But a lot of it is, it's just following instinct. I don't think about stuff like what the book is about, or what the book is really. I feel like a lot of that is you realize later, what your themes are. I always write about like childhood trauma and families and stuff like that, but I think everybody does. I mean, it's Shakespeare, it's Faulkner, it's everybody.
Yeah.
But that's just, we're all writers are probably writing like the same 3 or 4 stories over and over again. Like My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies is about a teenage girl, but like almost all the stuff that she's talking about her life, like all the flashback scenes to her childhood, that's all just like me sort of writing about my mom and writing about some of my friends that, I knew growing up whose parents were like addicts and stuff. And, that book feels very personal to me. Like the Last of the Innocent criminal book that you mentioned, like that's sort of my first attempt at doing like a post YA thing. And that was inspired by like the death of my father, which he died like on Halloween, like 10 years ago now. That sort of sent me into like right after his death, they started, getting ready for Christmas and Thanksgiving, and everything on TV was like Rankin and Bass specials. And it just sent me into this huge wave of nostalgia for my childhood. And I was sitting around reading old Archie comics, and I just started thinking about like using all of that to sort of like process like whatever, grief I was going through at the time over my dad. And, then ended up, kind of writing like a dark version of like what would happen if the characters from kids comics grew up in the world of Criminal.
Mm-hmm.
And, but yeah, that was why I had the sort of Encyclopedia Brown riff in there, which my joke in there, which no one got, was that like when he finally confronts the main character about the crime, everything he's saying is wrong. Like he's totally got the story wrong. He's not a good detective. He was a little kid who thought he could catch people in lies.
That's hilarious.
But yeah, there was like a Richie Rich stand-in in that thing. Gordy Gold. I was like, I just liked, it's like there's some part of what I'm doing that obviously touches on my own sort of love and history of growing up with comics and stuff. So it's I don't know. I feel like something about comics in general just implies nostalgia. Like if you look at like Chris Ware's books, they sort of imply a nostalgia for something that you maybe never even lived through.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's a fun thing to tap into in comics. But yeah, that probably was a moment too where I thought more again about like trying to do like a post YA thing, because I thought I was the only one who was ever going to like that book. And then that turned out to be like our biggest hit for Criminal.
Yeah.
I think. And people still talk to me about it all the time. I was just like emailing with Roberto Aguirre Sacasa, who still gives that book to people when they start working on Riverdale. Which I was like, oh, wow, that's cool. Yeah, it's just, I definitely feel like, like I've talked to other writer friends about this. In my mind, I start from character and I have goalposts, and I usually know what the end of the story is going to be. But as I'm doing the part of like writing the story, I usually need to keep a certain amount of mystery to myself. Otherwise it'll just get boring to write,
Yeah. Well, and you talked about how the difference between being like a novelist and working in comics is a lot of it comes from the fact that like Sean needs scripts, or like Marcos is a specific type of storyteller. And I think that's really interesting. Like you think about Friday Fitzhugh as a character, she's quite the badass, but also seemingly more of like a let your actions speak type. I mean, she's like seemingly famous for ice balls, which is super badass. Also really deadly, I feel.
Yeah, hitting someone with a rock covered in like snow and ice would really knock them out.
Totally. That might actually get her arrested for assault. But I am.
Yeah, no. Friday is violent.
But you talked about how you saw that image that Marcos did, where she was like younger, she was 13ish or whatever, and she was playing, and she had a hockey stick and everything. I am curious about how, like, characters like that, how a character like Friday or Lancelot changes as you and Marcos start putting the book together. Because maybe what Marcos does, or maybe what Munsa does, changes what you think about these characters yourself.
Oh yeah, totally. Like I hadn't pictured that Friday would smoke, but it's perfect.
Oh, totally.
And it was just in like one of the sketches, there was like a page of sketches of her at different ages. And one of them, she was like smoking a cigarette. And I just thought, oh, that's perfect, because she just went away to college. So of course, like that first year when you come back from college, you're like trying to be so adult. So of course she would smoke and be into different bands and, like all that stuff. Like I totally viscerally remember that first those first years, like after high school and not being in the same town, like when I would come home for Christmas and like you'd end up calling like your friends from high school to hang out one night and everyone would get drunk and stupid. And, like I just like remember that feeling so much of like coming back after you've gone away and you were supposed to be different and everyone's treating you the same. And it's like, I never want to see these people again.
I had a very weird experience because I went to college with my 4 best friends and in high school, and then we all went to the same school. And it was kind of funny because we all simultaneously kind of, changed, but we were also all together all the time, basically. And so it was kind of like we were
crazy.
fused by our different experiences, I don't know.
Yeah.
It was weird. Well, for you, I think it is interesting because I feel like when people say Ed Brubaker, they often say Sean Phillips. And so there's a certain like mind meld that I imagine that you've accomplished over the past couple decades of working together. But with Marcos, I don't believe you'd ever worked with him. And
we did a Captain America annual that he drew half of, him and Javier Polito, like alternated chapters because an artist had dropped out at the last minute, like, and we were like a month away from print on like a 48-page thing. So they just like jammed through it, like alternating chapters. And it was lucky that I had written it in a way that it was broken down into chapters. But that was like 15 years ago or something like that. It was like during my first couple of years on Captain America. And it was like a World War II story. It was cool. It was fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just always loved his stuff, but I never imagined we'd work together again. So he just like, we kept in touch just, so I would like email him when I saw one of his comics that I liked, but I was always like super jealous whenever, like Mark Waid or whoever got to work with them.
Yeah. Well, how different is it writing, or, when you don't have that mind meld, when you don't have a couple decades of experience, is it any different when you're trying to write for somebody that you haven't had a lot of experience with than it is with Sean? Because I'm sure you and Sean have like shorthands and cadences and everything figured out because you know each other.
I mean, to some degree, I think we always like try to surprise each other to some degree too. Like I never tell him what the story is going to be about, and he never shows me the pencils almost ever. But yeah, I mean, we've been working together for so long that like when I think about comics, I think about them being drawn by Sean usually, and writing for him, I put in a lot less detail into like the panel descriptions than I might for other people. But, Marcos and I emailed back and forth so much before I even started writing the first script, or maybe I was like halfway through writing the first script when I started seeing like character sketches and stuff like that. And like he did a lot of like, this is what the town's going to look like. This is what my art might look like. And, we spent so much time going back and forth on that by the time I sent him the first script, like I was confident that, there was probably a little bit more detail than he actually needed, but that I was confident in, that everything was there that he needed and he'd be able to draw the thing because I'd seen what the town was going to look like and who the characters were. Like he spent probably 4 or 5 months just doing that stuff before he actually started drawing the script. Because he just wanted to really make sure, that he knew what the hell he was doing. And, but yeah, he did like layouts and he walked me through like any place he made a change, or if he wanted to do a transition differently, or if he wanted to take a panel and split it into 2 panels or something, which he did here and there, but it was like really rare. And, I don't know, I guess maybe because we'd worked together before, or maybe just because comics is both of our sort of universal language, we didn't really have any issues. Like, he's one of the best storytellers I've ever, seen in comics. And I grew up writing and drawing my own comics. And so like, it's always been pretty easy for me to work with artists because a lot of artists will tell me that, my scripts are really easy for them to visualize. I think part of it is because I write scripts for them similar to how I used to write them for myself. I don't put a lot of math in there. My scripts, if you look at other people's scripts compared to mine, I don't have like numbers next to things really. It's much more organic, where I'm just sort of talking to the artists and giving them just what they need. and, occasionally like telling them if something's going to be like a full tier or whatever. I just try to like get out of the way of the words. And even it used to drive me crazy. DC would make me go in and add like 1, 2, 3, 4. And then if I was having to rewrite stuff, it would just drive me crazy knowing that the balloons were I was like, does assistant editor do this? Like after when it's on the way to the letterer, like there's only 2 word balloons on this page. Like, why do I have to number them? But it's like, it's like that stuff just gets in my head. I don't know. I have my own superstitions about it. Like Fraction works in a format that he refers to as the modified Brubaker because my format was just too just straightforward and simple. It's just like panel description, dialogue, indent the dialogue.
I bet the artists love that though.
Yeah, it's worked out for me. I've not gotten on with every single artist I worked with. Certainly a lot of like shorter term jobs, like if you don't have time to like find a rhythm with someone, it can really, you can get a great artist but just not be like jiving together. Whereas with Marcos, like I was already such a fan of what he did, and we were trying to create something new that, I think like I sent him the script and he just was immediately like, oh, this is perfect. And just, went back to his sketches and layouts and stuff and worked on all that forever. So it hasn't really been much of a learning curve. I feel like we're both just kind of trying to impress each other at this point.
I was thinking back on it when I was rereading Friday last night. I feel like there's like those 2 double page spreads, and they're kind of double page spreads in some ways. And in other ways, they're just kind of like 2 pages that are single pages kind of like put together as a double page spread that just continues. And I was thinking about
the storybook
the storybook stuff, and I was trying to remember, like, I don't feel like you use those very often, and I kind of wondered if that was like something Marcos was like, this is the right way to do this, or if that's just like something you.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I wrote those as just like single pages, and he did that as a double page spread. The opening spread of the town. Like when I wrote the script, I was just picturing it all as single pages. And then when he did it as the widescreen, I was like, oh, that looks really great. And now I've got a much better idea of the size of the town and the layout of the place and where the lighthouse is. Because Lance and his dad like live at the house by the lighthouse because his dad's the lighthouse keeper. Mm-hmm. So it's like I could get a sense of like where Friday's house was, and so it was really cool to see like stuff like that. And like he added that he took the last panel and turned it into a whole splash page with the owl in the tree,
which I love. That was so
like
good.
A single panel, but he was like, oh no, I want to have. He wanted to have an even number of pages. So like page 1 becomes page like 1 and 2 for him. Mm-hmm. But I need to like keep track of my page turns. So it's been our one conflict. But no, it's all like been totally great. But yeah, no, that was all like him like making those decisions. And part of that is because, we know it's going to be printed as a book. And so like it can have spreads like that. We both are very cognizant of like the pages that are double page spreads, not having too much like text on them. Mm-hmm. Or not, text near where the gutters will be eventually when it's printed, stuff like that. But yeah, no, it's just fun to see, and it's fun to know that with Panel Syndicate, like we put out the 2 different versions of it, where one was for people who wanted to read it on their computers, and one was more for like iPad or Kindle readers or whatever. Nooks, I guess, if people still have a Nook. I don't think that's a thing.
I don't know. Well, I did want to ask about because the Panel Syndicate part's really interesting to me, because you have your deal with Image where you and Sean can do whatever, but the Panel Syndicate thing is really interesting because it's like you're both you do the digital version at Panel Syndicate, and then you later release in trade or in a collection at Image.
Yeah.
And I feel like you doing
hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. I feel like you doing this is very interesting because I've been curious over the past few years, but especially now. Obviously, it wasn't a reaction to the current situation we're in, but seeing creators, if they're going to do more things like Panel Syndicate or doing kind of these digital projects, what was the appeal of working on a Panel Syndicate comic in specific? Was there something in there that fascinated you even beyond working with Marcos on this project? I
mean, yeah, the fact of being able to release, something that like every chapter could be a different length of pages. Like you don't always, like with Criminal, they're always like a 40-page book that we have to put together every month.
Right.
Which is, 24 to 30 pages of comics and then like a bunch of extra stuff. And it just becomes like exhausting at some point that every 4 weeks you're like putting one of these things to press. So the idea of being able to just do a graphic novel and release each chapter, and the chapters could be anywhere from like 16, 18, 24 pages. They've all been longer than that because, I've just been enjoying it too much. Mm-hmm. But, in theory, it was like, oh, these could be, we could do some shorter chapters, some longer chapters. And like, I really am a big fan of like Emily Carroll and Joey Walden. A lot of them will put up like short stories or like chapters of like the graphic novels they're working on online for people to just read as they're working on them. And like, I like that idea because like, it really bums me out that I did the Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 books for the Fade Out instead of just waiting until the whole thing was in one book. Mm-hmm. Because that means there's a bunch of people out there who've only read like part one or part 1 and 2 and never got around to reading part 3. Mm-hmm. And like, with this, I didn't, maybe there'll be people who do that with the digital version. Like they don't end up reading it all the way through, but eventually there'll be a book, and anyone who buys the book and starts it probably will read the whole thing,
Yeah.
Because that's what you do with comics, even if you don't really love them. You're like, well, maybe this will get good at the end. But yeah, it's like that drives me crazy sometimes, knowing that there are people who start reading one of my stories and don't finish it.
Yeah.
Which is like, it's like both because I was like, fuck, I didn't keep them hooked, but also because it's like, well, maybe they just couldn't find the next book.
Yeah.
So the idea of just anyone who buys issue 1 or chapter 1 will be able to get, when chapter 2, comes out, they're going to get an email telling them that it's out. Like, that's great. But I mean, a lot of it was just the chance to work with Marcos, really. Like, that was the biggest draw for me. And then also just sort of seeing what this site is like, because like I said, when we're talking pre-recording, like digital comics have just been so expensive. So yeah, I mean, I'm just like a print person kind of. So for me, it was like the ability to try to create something with an artist I loved that I could think about like the final end result. And while we're working on it, I can also see like, okay, what is this platform that he's built? And like, is there a way to reach like people who aren't going into, the places that our work is normally sold by this? And like, it's crazy. Like, I was emailing with Marcos the other night after like 5 days. He said we'd been downloaded in almost 100 countries. Just that kind of crazy reach, and that he put it out in English and Spanish at the same time. Like we were emailing the night before release to go over like the Spanish version because I had to help him on a couple parts for like the understanding the intent of the dialogue or something. So like that part of it has been really interesting to me and fun. And the pay what you want thing was really fascinating to me too, because like I said, I'm like a print guy. So when I I don't even have an iPad. Like, I borrowed my wife's iPad to like read the comic on the iPad to see what it would read like. Because I wanted to see, okay, well, this is how most people will probably read it, is like on an iPad, which it looked great. Like, it's designed to be printed at like 6x9, the same size as the Darwin Cook, like Parker book, like the original editions of those that came out. So it's like perfect to view on an iPad. But like, one of the things that really always has turned me off about digital comics is they're just so expensive and you don't actually get anything, it's
right.
Like you're just getting the privilege of reading it. And it's like, like I just assumed when I first saw like the iPad and Comixology and all that stuff that 99 cents would become like the default, eventually. Like maybe they would just wait to release the stuff until after it had been in comic stores. But then seeing that like it all comes out the same price as the print version. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to stick with print then, because, and occasionally when I can't get a book, I'll like go on Apple or on Amazon and like buy the Kindle version of that issue of, some comic that I couldn't get to the store for. And then it was sold out, and, then I read it. But like, like I've, I felt more like Panel Syndicate was probably a better chance to reach people who weren't, really investing in that kind of mainstream digital comics part of it, because it's not Comixology. It's its own platform, for one thing. And most of the people that go there started going there because, they did the Private Eye, and like Brian Vaughan is like the biggest writer in the world. So it's like, it's just a different audience, I feel like. And, a lot of the mail we've gotten from people are people who've never read anything by me before. So,
Yeah.
like, that's been kind of insane.
Well, that was actually one of the things I was going to bring up, because I think I love the Panel Syndicate for a number of reasons. One, I love just the sense of urgency it creates when, oh, Friday is on Wednesday. I'm like, what's that? And then the next day I'm like, oh, I can buy this comic. And it's just you can't create that sense of urgency with the way the print comics work, because it's always going to be 3 months out or 12 months out or whatever the cadence is. And so you can create a sense of urgency with that. And then beyond that, the nice thing, as you noted,
Kirkman tried to do that with that Die, Die, Die book.
Right.
He just released it to retailers, but he had to give away the first issue or the first couple of issues. I can't remember what the deal was, but it's he just printed a bunch of them and just sent them out because he wanted there to be a surprise for readers when they got to the store that week, because we all have that feeling of like you could basically follow what's happening in comics by reading the solicitations for a lot of them. Right. At least back when I was working at Marvel and DC, you, especially DC basically told you what happened in the book, and it's that's why none of my solicitations ever reveal really anything. They're always one vague sentence, because it's I don't want people to be able to read this thing. It's Sean and I have been doing comics for 20 years. You're just order however many you can sell.
It's really funny. So when I got to Criminal number 12, I also don't read solicitations because frankly, I mean, I don't think I've ever read a solicit that actually convinces me to buy a comic. It's either it looks good to me or I like the creators or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, they're just a tool for the retailers, really. It's weird to me that they became a thing that's aimed at the market. And I was thinking maybe one of the great things that could come out of this whole shutdown is maybe we get rid of that part.
Yeah.
Somehow. The selling a magazine to people to tell them what comics are coming out 3 months from now is weird.
It is really weird. But with Criminal number 12, the funny thing is I didn't even know that was the last issue. And when I got to the end and I was reading your write-up, I was like, oh, this is over. Okay, then. But I actually like that because, I had Jonathan Hickman on a podcast back in September to talk about all the X-Men stuff. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about what he said was how he was using kind of the data pages and all the other stuff he did in his X-Men stuff, because partially, because he loves doing that stuff, but also he wanted to mess with the cadence of the single issue format, because you kind of always know what a print single issue is going to read like, because first off, you have it in your hands, but also everyone's used to that 20-page cadence. And he wanted to make it longer to mess with that rhythm. And with with Panel Syndicate stuff, whether you're reading Private Eye or Barrier or Universe or your stuff, you read that and you never really have a sense for what it's going to be, because it can be anything.
Yeah, no, totally. I'm kind of spoiled because Sean is faster than most artists too. So all of our books, ever since we started Criminal, we've never done a single issue that's been less than 24 pages. And usually we go, I think 24 is our average, but I would probably say half of our issues go 26 or 28 and often into the 30s, because it's just do you have enough time to draw 4 more pages? I need 4 more pages for this issue,
Yeah.
And so I've been kind of spoiled by that. So with the Panel Syndicate thing, it was it can be just however long it ends up being, because we're not printing it until later. And it's and then we'll figure out how many, signatures this is. But yeah, I don't know. It's been an interesting thing. What's funny is how many of the people who I don't have social media. I'm not on Facebook or Twitter or anything. I just have a newsletter that goes out to a bunch of people. And I got a ton of email the first day when we announced Friday from people just saying, "Oh, I can't wait for the print version. I'm not going to read a digital comic." You could go and get it for free if you want and just try it out, but okay.
I also think it's funny that people actually tell you that.
Yeah, people tell you all sorts of things you'd be surprised they tell you when you're. I mean, also I realize it's. I never like hold any kind of weird thing that a fan says to me against them because I've been like that nervous fan
Oh,
who's like,
sure.
oh my God, Joss Whedon's standing right there and I'm going to say the stupidest thing, like I've been that weird guy writing in like a fan letter, like like you look back at that stuff and you're like, God, why did I tell him I didn't like that issue of Captain America?
I one time introduced myself to an artist and I thanked them for the work that they did on a comic that I loved. And then when I walked away, I realized it was the wrong person. And I was so nervous.
Oh, yeah.
And the artist was so nice about it. They definitely were like, oh, yeah, thanks. I really appreciate your kind words about my work. And then I walk away. I'm like, shit, that was the wrong person. So they were totally rolled with it. I mean, I think we've all been that nervous fan.
Go with it on stuff like that. Yeah, but you get that, especially like comics fans, like, like at Comic-Con, they wait in line and they want to just kind of like talk to you for a minute. Like the autograph, I feel like is really just sort of the excuse for them to be able to sort of have a moment with someone whose work like means something to them. So I always like cut everybody a ton of slack on any kind of, like blunt, weird thing that they say to you that you're just there. You'll have someone just say like, oh, I don't usually like your stuff, but I love this book. Well, you could have left out the first part. That would have been awesome. But then at the same time, I'm kind of like, well, fucking good for you for being honest.
Yeah.
Like, I bet you're going to be kicking yourself for that later, that you can't believe you said that, like, but believe it or not, I'm fine with it.
I always find those characters to be so fascinating. There's this one guy who always writes into Image books, particularly Kirkman books. And I actually talked to Kirkman about it, and I wrote an article about this guy. His name is Andrew J. Shaw.
Jesus. Which one of us is this?
No, he's a letter hack, and he writes in to like every Image book, and it's like almost like he's a character. And I've come to realize that a lot of editors actually have like fan theories about him. Basically, his name's Andrew J. Shaw, and it's just like he's like this total wild card when he writes in letters, and like sometimes he's like complimenting you, but then you're like, are you complimenting me? I love it. I think it's so funny.
Yeah,
that's just one of those weird things about comics that just kind of, I don't know. I mean, I'm fond of letters columns and like the back matter that you all do with the write ups, but also what you're sharing in the back of each issue you do of Sean, and part of it is because it kind of makes there's like a community feel to it, and I like that.
Yeah. Oh, totally. That's why I've always, like, with our single issues, and, I hope to do that with all the chapters of Friday that we're putting out, like, have extra stuff. Like, we got a ton of mail, actually, for a digital comic. I was like, wow, we're getting, like, dozens and dozens of emails from people. Like, it felt like a lot of people who read it just really responded. So I was like, oh, cool. But, yeah, I always thought that, too. It's like you want to make it feel like some sort of club that the readers are part of. And like with Criminal early on, I just thought, well, the people who are buying these single issues are basically paying for the existence of this comic. And, if we get to keep doing it and put out trades and stuff, like it's because these people bought these single issues. So I always wanted to make the single issues just something special. So that's why I always just kind of thought of the Criminal, especially as like a magazine that we serialize our comics in, but like the back pages stuff is like, I talk to people about like what I'm reading or watching, and then we have an article and Sean does illustrations. Like I just always want it to feel like something special and a little bit bigger than, what you get from, your average comic that, for a while was even more expensive than ours. And it was like printed on shit paper and you get like 20 pages maybe.
Yeah.
So like it was funny, for years I was like arguing that Marvel should do self-covered comics because they could put them on better paper and save like a bunch of money on, save like $100,000 a month in printing or something. And then when they finally did self-covered comics, they just used like the cruddy inside paper instead. I was like, wow, so these just feel worthless, but you're charging $4 or $5 for them. So I was just like, wow, like we always have like the best possible paper. When I first got to Image, I was like, I think I was the first person there for a long time who used like a heavyweight, like matte finish paper. And then Kirkman and Hickman both saw it and they both put all their books on it, and then we ran out of the paper immediately. Like, God damn it. We were like trying to find like a comparable paper that was good. But yeah, I always want those packages to just feel like, when you get one of our books, like it's just something special that I want it to be worth your time and your money, and I was so gratified to hear from Marcos how many people were actually paying, because it was like, more than he expected and more than their averages. And I feel like partly it's just right now in our time where like people know that everybody's fucked and everybody's out of work. And, like with the comics industry right now, like everybody I know is worried that, this is it. Like we know there'll be some kind of comics market on the other side of this, but we just have no idea what it's going to be. And if all the money that Diamond owes our publishers will ever get paid, and whether it'll get paid to us. And, pretty much everyone in creator-owned comics is writing off a year of, their income right now. And there's not a lot of people who can totally afford to do that.
Yeah.
Most people cannot afford to do that. I cannot afford to do that. Sean cannot afford to do that. So it's like, we're all looking for like solutions of like, okay, well, what can I do to try to like make money and keep, our income coming in? Like Sean and I were counting on Pulp coming out in May. Like we spent, most of the year, the first part of the year, working on this book and killing ourselves to get it to this print deadline so it could be out in May. And then the day we get it to Image to go to the printer, like Diamond shuts down.
Right.
So I was like, oh, wait, okay, so shit. Well, maybe we're not going to print this book right now. I don't know what's happening. So it's a weird time. So yeah, but to see like, people out there who care about comics especially, or care about anything, like they all know, like people are donating to these comic store causes that, people were paying like twice as much for this as they would have paid for a print comic, some of them. And just because they were just so happy to have something and they wanted us to like know that they supported it. And that was really kind of amazing.
Yeah. I mean, and I think we've seen that across, like you mentioned Creators for Comics earlier. It's like, you've seen people stepping up to try to help however they can. Like myself.
Well, they need to raise like $5 or $10 million to keep the stores like alive. I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, I don't know how it's gonna work out. Jim Lee seems to be raising a lot of money, and Rob Liefeld. But like, yeah, I think realistically, if this shutdown goes on for 2 or 3 months, it's taking like $10 million out of the comics industry or something like that, if not more.
Yeah, it is
kind of crazy.
It is really, and there's also a cascading effect that I think people forget about, because it's like, like you're saying, it's like if Diamond closes and shops close, then publishers don't get money, and then creators don't get money, and it's just it spreads everywhere. And
yeah, we really need Diamond not to close.
Yeah,
it's when distributors go under, they leave everybody like with like 6 months of unpaid books basically, and then you can't get your books back either. It's just like a whole fucking thing.
It's definitely exposed it as a bit of a house of cards, and like with one card that's very tenuous. I mean, I had Heidi McDonald on the podcast and we talked about this, and I mentioned that basically it was something that really required one specific type of calamity to happen for this to reveal itself. Like everyone always suspected it, but it took one type of thing for it to happen, and the wrong thing happened.
Yeah, but I had no idea. I mean, comics isn't that different than it turns out the majority of the economy needs for stores to be able to be open.
Yeah, look at AMC movie theaters.
Like most stores were going like month to month. Most stores weren't sitting around being able to be like, oh yeah, we can close for 6 months and not fire anybody.
Right.
Like everybody relies on like constant cash flow. Of course, in like other countries like France and England, they're basically just giving all those shops money so they don't fire people. They're just covering like their costs. They're not like giving them their profit, but they're like, everybody's been faced with this exact calamity, so let's treat everybody equally. It's like, we should be doing that here, but because the small business thing has gone so poorly, like a ton of these comic stores aren't going to be able to qualify for loans to stay in business. It sucks.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really weird though to see that like so much of the world's economy, but so much of America's economy was just precariously balanced and counting on like the treadmill constantly moving. And it's like you stop the treadmill for a month and like the entire fucking world falls apart. gas or fucking oil was trading for negative $23 a barrel yesterday.
Yeah.
You had to pay someone $23 to take your oil barrel.
I got a tank of gas, which normally, I don't even know how much it costs, like $40 for $14 the other day, and it's just like, it's astonishing. But I don't know. I mean, the last thing I want to bring us to is kind of related to that, because you talked about Pulp, which is your upcoming original graphic novel with Sean. And then you have Friday, which we've been talking about this whole time. And I do think it's really interesting, because I'm not saying you, obviously you couldn't plan for a pandemic, but as far as like things you could have done, the types of stories you could have had to be like leading into a pandemic, with having like something like an original graphic novel that will be available for bookstores and comic shops, not that they weren't already, but immediately so. And then having something digital where people can buy it immediately. I feel like that's, as far as things can be fortuitous in a time like this, it was, I think, fortuitous in a way. Have you been toying around with format more lately, or is this just kind of the way things worked out? Like, are you interested in doing other things?
I mean, I still just want to do comics as long as I can do them, you know, like Sean and I have talked about just doing graphic novels, and, you know, I love the books that we've done so far, but they're all just like a short story that you turn into like a 70 something page book. And like, that's one of the things I like about Friday, is that I know, you know, I can sort of let the story breathe as long as it needs to. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like I talked to Kirkman about this the other day, and it's like, in some ways we're all trying to figure out what's going to come after this and what's going to be there. But it's like, none of us can really know, because the facts just keep changing week to week to week. And so on one level, like Sean and I, certainly we were going to launch a monthly comic in August, and like, that's not happening right now, obviously, right. Because we don't even know if there's going to be like, you know, like solicits for August at this point. Like, hopefully August comic stores will be buying books again. But like, for the time being, like, you know, like nobody's paying anybody right now. And, you know, everyone that works at Image is waiting to hear what's going on with Diamond. And it just is like suddenly this really precarious time where like Sean and I are going to keep doing comics together. But, you know, like I was like, all right, well, we're not launching like this monthly series that's going to go like 2 or 3 years long right now. Like, I'm going to wait and see like what the ground looks like on the other side of this. And for now, I have another idea that we're going to do that's like a serialized graphic novel thing, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to put that out, because we need to, you know, we can only go so long without having any income from our work. And, you know, we spent an entire quarter of the year working on this thing that we were counting on for like a huge part of our publishing income for the year, and now it's just on hold. And, you know, we have no idea what kind of market we'll be able to release it into, whether it'll be half as many stores or what, you know. So like suddenly everything was going really great for us, and we have all these books in print and everything, but now it's all super precarious. And, you know, and we're not by far the worst off in this field. Like, I have so many friends who have like 5 or 6 issues out that they still haven't been paid for. And, you know, like everybody that I know is just kind of like trying to go on as if we're just going to get back to some sense of normal soon. But really, we have no idea. So, yeah, I had this thought about writing like a short story for Sean to draw. Right now he's drawing our story for you probably know this, but we're overseeing the second Parker Martini edition as sort of like a tribute to Darwin.
Oh wow, no, I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Oh yeah, Sean's helping design it, and I'm writing some text stuff for it. And we did an original story. We got permission from Donald Westlake's wife I had to write the story before we got permission, which was nerve-wracking. I actually had to write like a whole script and count on someone who, you know, probably isn't super into comics reading a script before it's been drawn. So that was like a nerve-wracking couple of weeks of like waiting for the word whether we were going to get to do the story or not. But no one's ever written like an original story with any of the Parker characters before. They've always been Donald Westlake stories. So this was like a huge deal for me because I'm just, Donald Westlake is like a huge influence on what I do. The Richard Stark books, are probably the biggest influence on what I've done, even though I don't feel like we do the same thing. But definitely writing this story, I was like, wow, I lifted a lot from this guy. like stylistically, this is not hard for me to write like a story that like sounds kind of like him. I was like, I must have lifted a lot from whenever I do third person, like, cause he always wrote in third person, or for the most part. So, but yeah, Sean's drawing that story now, which is like an 18-page story for the second Martini edition, which will come out in the fall. And that's just like an original story that I wrote for him to draw for that. And that's like a tribute to Donald Westlake and Darwin, like the story is itself. But yeah, he's drawing that right now, and we're just sort of trying to figure out, well, what's next?
Yeah.
And, we need to figure it out in the next like week or so. And we're just kind of waiting to hear, like, is our publisher going to be getting the money from the distributor? Are they going to be able to pay us like advances or publish, or like what's happening even? So it's a really bizarre time, especially for us. I'm glad we had that Parker story happening because, otherwise 3 weeks ago I would have been like, fuck, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Like right now I can kind of wait it out like another week or so before I have to like make any firm decisions. But yeah, at some point I'm going to have to like pull the trigger one way or the other. Either we're going to start working on this monthly comic and just bank a lot of issues, or we're going to start working on another graphic novel. So we may just end up having like a graphic novel out in December or something.
Wow.
Just go graphic novel. But the one that I started working on is so different than anything we've done. And I think partly inspired by the fact that we're all just like locked up right now and it feels like the world is ending. I started writing a very sort of bizarre noir story, almost like Kafka-esque noir, but I hesitate to use that word because I hate it. and it probably won't end up being that at all. But it's definitely trying to do some different stuff than what we've just finished. Whereas like Pulp actually is sort of about Nazis and the 1918 pandemic, which I didn't realize when we were doing it that was going to be relevant. I mean, then I knew the Nazi part would be relevant, but because most of Pulp takes place in February of 1939 in New York, where when the Nazi Bund people were having that rally in Madison Square Garden. But yeah, a lot of the stuff about the Wild West hero is like his life story, which you realize as you're reading it that like how the Spanish flu pandemic like affected his life.
That is wild.
So
you're having some interesting timings right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it could be worse. Like we could have had the book printed and then have nowhere to send it to.
That's
just
true.
Paying Diamond for storage, I guess.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how it all works out. I mean, honestly, like I hate to say it like this, but it's like I've told people this before. I hope it all wraps up quickly for, societal reasons and for the fact that obviously all this stuff is horrible for all kinds of different reasons, but also so people like you and Sean can get back to doing what you do and having a little bit of certainty in your lives. But Ed, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about Friday and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks. I feel really bad like whining about our situation. We're pretty lucky. A lot of people, not in comics have it way worse than us. A lot of people, there are people who have family members dying, or there are people who work in hospitals. Like it feels really small to be like talking about comics in that world. But at the same time, it's like everybody everywhere. Like I hear people walking by on the street, like walking their dogs and talking on the phone, and everybody's just talking about their job, and they're totally freaked out about whether their career path that they've chosen and spent decades on is even going to exist, in 2 months. And it's like, I don't think, I guess it must have been like that 100 years ago. I don't know.
I mean, I live in a state that is entirely dependent on oil, and oil literally has negative prices right now, which you were saying. And so
Oh
it's
yeah, you guys have socialism there where you all get checks for the oil.
oh yeah, we do. Permanent fund dividend. I'll tell you what, when there's negative oil prices, there ain't much of a permanent fund.
Yeah. No. Plus, you live in like America's Australia. Let me just like get everyone in Alaska to hate me. It's like there's that great old Modest Mouse song, Trucker's Atlas, about like gonna go up to Alaska and get off scot fucking free, and we all did. I was like, I remember when I lived in Seattle, you would occasionally run into people who were on their way to Alaska, and it was like, "Are you jumping bail?"
Yeah, there's like the people who are like live free or die, and then there's the people who move to Alaska who are like another level of that. And I don't know. I have
like
family
Get
members.
off my land.
Yeah, I have family members whose stories are, let's just say that they moved for legal reasons. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, that's what The Simpsons do in The Simpsons movie.
Exactly. And who knew that apparently the Simpsons movie was actually like biographical in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. Well, all right, man. Well, thanks so much for giving us the coverage, and this was fun.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Ed Brubaker. You can find his work in Friday at panelsyndicate.com and the upcoming Image Comics graphic novel Pulp. As a heads up, Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out the new version of the site and consider subscribing for access to all of the site's content and its members-only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched, that's SKTCHD, following it on Twitter at SketchComic, or following me at @SlicedFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Matt, Charlie Chu, Greg Peterson, Stephen Hall, Dan Lee, Cameron Schrader, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Mara, Christian Sheldon, Kenny Porter, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Groenbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Harry Sayer, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mazel, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Troy Jeffrey Allen, Leona Kangas, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ryanwan, Vita Yala, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil, Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pinella, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Brody, Ira James Udaskin, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Greg Rucka, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Chris Hallren, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.